Now, very quickly after those attacks in Lebanon on Tuesday, horrific images emerged from the hospitals that were treating the thousands of injured people, and those hospitals appear to be completely overwhelmed. Well, for more on this, we can cross to Oxford and we can speak to Dr Nick Maynard, a surgeon who makes regular trips to Gaza to carry out emergency procedures. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. From your extensive hands-on experience operating on patients who've been affected by bombings and similar types of injury, how does a hospital cope with such a sudden influx of injured people?
Thank you very much for asking me on today. In short, with great difficulty, even when hospitals are in areas which are used to violence, no hospital is ever fully equipped to take on mass casualties like that. And to deal with a huge influx, many dozens sometimes, if not more than that, of acutely injured patients, totally saturates the ability of the hospital to deal with it, really. And even the whole triage process, the process of prioritization of injuries, becomes extremely difficult to do with such mass casualties. So it is extremely difficult for really any hospital in the world to cope with that.
Indeed. I mean, one would assume as well that when a child comes into a hospital injured in a situation like that, they'd go to the front of the queue, but there could be other children in front of them. I mean, it sounds like absolutely mission impossible.
It is. I mean, and I experienced this on many occasions in my time in Gaza since October the 7th last year. Literally, I mean, with all these patients arriving, there aren't enough doctors and nurses on duty to deal with them. There aren't enough people to really prioritize them. So you will get, as you describe, many children coming in with, traumatic amputations of their limbs, people coming in with shrapnel injuries, and the sort of injuries these patients have received in Lebanon will be very similar to the shrapnel injuries that bomb victims get. And they can have multiple injuries involving the chest, involving the abdomen, involving the limbs. And they'll be bleeding heavily, so they're going to need emergency treatment. And it's extremely difficult to triage them properly and to make sure they all get appropriately quick treatment.
And it must be really adding to the complication, this variety of injuries you describe. Some hospitals will have an expertise and a specialisation in one field, others will have specialisation in another. And if you've got people with multiple injuries, it's impossible to compute how a hospital would determine how it's going to treat people in that kind of a situation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I imagine the patients are all going to acute hospitals which regularly do receive acute injuries and illnesses, and they will have the sort of hospitals that I'm used to working in the West will have a major disaster protocol, which will be a really robust protocol to draw in all available doctors. And that sort of protocol is initiated, for example, in Oxford, when you might have a dozen injuries coming in. I think the scale that we're seeing in Lebanon and the scale that we saw in Gaza is far, far greater than that. And they will have doctors from different specialists, but they simply won't have enough. It'll be the sheer volume that makes it so difficult.
I don't know if you had a chance to see some of the pictures of people there in Lebanon. I saw some last night circulating on social media, really gruesome pictures, people bloodied from head to toe with severe injuries, young, old, male, female, young, old. As I said, I mean, when you look at the variety of injuries, really severe injuries in some cases, hands, eyes, legs, I mean, what kind of a future do people face if they've got injuries of that degree of seriousness?
Yeah, very, very tough futures. And of course, you'll see, I saw quite a few of the photos, and you see some of the very obvious injuries, the severe limb injuries, the eye injuries. The most common type of injury will be the limb injuries, and we saw huge numbers of those when I was in Gaza. And they'll be devastating because some of the children and young adults will be losing limbs, and of course there's all the rehabilitation that goes with that. And many of these countries, certainly in Gaza, I don't know so much about Lebanon, but certainly in Gaza, the ability to rehabilitate these patients is very, very limited. But there's also the so-called hidden injuries that there won't be immediately obvious, the severe injuries to the abdomen and to the chest. And these are very typical shrapnel injuries where very, very small pieces of metal or stone or plastic from the pages will be slicing through the abdomen and the chest and causing a huge amount of internal damage to all the different organs in the abdomen and the chest. And that initially they're hidden injuries because you don't know they're there, because the entry point may be only a few millimeters wide, but they can cause enormous amount of damage. So yes, I think what we've seen so far may just be the tip of the, but there may be far more injuries than we're actually seeing.
Yeah, in fact, the numbers of injured have varied enormously, varying from one source to another. And of course, another hidden injury will be the psychological trauma, or for example, children in particular will have endured. Just going back to the hospitals, I mean, what sort of supplies will they be particularly short of in a sudden, unexpected emergency situation like this one? I mean, we've seen pictures of people queuing up, donating blood. Is that helpful?
Yeah, most certainly. And again, I don't know the Lebanese hospitals. I don't know how well resourced they are to start with, but the sheer volume of injuries coming in will rapidly deplete all the stores they have, particularly blood products. That's almost always the thing that goes first when there's a lot of injured patients. So giving blood or other blood products to save these lives will be very difficult. So there'll be a rapid call for emergency blood donors to come along and donate blood and other blood products so they can save these patients. But the other equipment, the intravenous fluids, the equipment for theatres can become rapidly depleted unless they've got good stores. And of course, this was a major problem that we saw in Gaza because there's been so little aid getting into Gaza that the stores were already almost empty. And then when you then got a mass casualty and dozens, if not up to 100 or two casualties coming in 24 hours, there were no resources to treat them. And that will rapidly become a problem in Lebanese hospitals if there is such a great volume of trauma victims coming in.
And then there's the decision-making that the doctors are having to make under enormous pressure, probably on, by this stage, very little sleep, in zero sleep, I'd imagine, for some doctors who've probably been working solidly for 36 hours, or 24 hours at least. When they're having to make sudden decisions and emergency decisions, they're not necessarily going to be the best decisions, are they, for the patient? They're just in the interest of perhaps saving the patient's life. But does that mean that perhaps more people will be amputated in a situation like this because it's either that or the patient's life is in danger? Is that part of the risk of operating under these kinds of pressures?
I guess there's always a risk of that, but these will be very well-trained doctors who are used to dealing with very sick and urgent patients. Now, of course, as I've said repeatedly, the volume will be a huge challenge, but they'll be very well-trained, I'm sure, in making very quick, rapid, urgent, and often life-saving decisions. So I'm sure, and yes, even when you're very busy, even when you've been operating for long hours, that ability, when you're well trained, almost becomes second nature. Eventually, the tiredness and the lack of sleep will have an impact. But I suspect they're very well trained, very used to doing this. And although they are very rapid decisions to be made, for someone who's doing it regularly, they're usually pretty straightforward decisions, very important decisions, but usually straightforward. And of course, there'll be, when the decisions might be difficult, they will call upon other colleagues who are equally experienced to share the decision making.
Let's just talk a bit about your experience in the field and operating in dangerous situations like Gaza. Just tell us a bit about that. And for example, what goes through your mind when you're working in a place like that, where your own life is in danger as well as that of the patient?
I mean, to say it's a challenging place to work is a huge understatement. I've been going to Gaza since 2010, so I've had many visits there before October the 7th. I've taught out there, I've operated out there, and carrying out, I mean, I'm a cancer surgeon, so I was helping them develop their cancer surgery services in Gaza. And it's always been very challenging working in Gaza because of the lack of resources. But it's the conditions one was used to. But since October the 7th, the challenges just became enormous. And I alluded a little bit to it. Very little resources. Fear that the hospital itself will be attacked. We were reassured at the beginning that the deconfliction process whereby the hospitals were protected would be sacrosanct. But of course, that's not been the case on many occasions in Gaza. I was working at Al-Aqsa Hospital, and I will remember the day on January the 5th, earlier this year, my first visit to Gaza. I've been there since, my first visit since October the 7th. And I was operating in Al-Aqsa Hospital, and there was an Israeli missile attack on the intensive care unit whilst I was in the operating theatre, and you could hear the bombs going off. So it's very frightening at the time. You have to concentrate on the job in hand. You have to carry on doing the life-saving operation you're doing. But it really makes you very concerned about working again in those circumstances. We had to evacuate. All the foreign doctors had to evacuate from Al-Aqsa Hospital immediately after that missile attack because, of course, it wasn't safe. But we went back again a few weeks later, knowing that threat was there, but knowing that our help was so essential that the need to go there really dwarfed. It didn't completely negate any fear. We were very aware of safety issues, but we felt a great need to go out there and continue our help.
Yeah, but I just want to, understand a little bit more about what motivates you to go to a place where you are so very much in danger. What goes through your mind?
Well, I can tell you what motivates me is my many years of experience of going to Gaza, loving the place, but most importantly, loving the people there. And I've made many very close friends, people I would call my family, who I've known for many years. And I spoke to them regularly straight after October the 7th, when all the atrocities started after then. And it was very clear to me they needed help. And when people who've been close friends for many years asked for your help, I felt obliged to go out there and help them, despite the risks to personal safety.
And as you said, you're an oncologist, a cancer surgeon, and presumably you're having to do a whole variety of different types of surgery as well as per requirements of the people coming into the hospitals. Is it very difficult to adapt from one type of surgery to another?
Yeah, it's a very good question, that. I mean, in many ways, the last thing they need in Gaza at the moment, tragically, is highly specialised cancer surgery. And they need people to do trauma. So I am a cancer surgeon, but I've been for many, many years, decades, I've been operating routinely on the abdomen and the chest, doing mainly cancer surgery. And the surgery I was doing was for trauma, but it was still major abdominal and thoracic surgery. So I was operating in areas I've been used to operating in for many, many years. And although we were dealing with trauma rather than cancer, it's not dissimilar surgery. We're operating on the same organs. But we were working in conjunction with the local surgeons, who, of course, are very, very experienced trauma surgeons. So we had a sort of very symbiotic relationship that we often operated together, and they were the more experienced emergency trauma surgeons, but I would be able to help with the more complex damaged organs, which I was used to operating on for cancer. So I think we all learned from each other very rapidly.
OK, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on Al Arabiya. Dr. Nick Maynard, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.